Hi everyone, it's Steph here, if you don't already know, and on this channel I just talk about all things careers and all things lifestyle. And in today's video, I am bringing you that video that I've been promising you for a hot second. I'm going to be telling you about everything I did in capital markets. We're going to be looking at the actual work I did. We're going to be looking at any BD, so business development, that I was able to do as well, some knowledge and know-how training that I did, group presentations / group tasks that I kind of did as well, and then also pro bono. If you like this kind of content, please do make sure that you like, comment and subscribe. And before we get even into the video, one thing I want to say is that for the purposes of this video, I honestly couldn't go into every single definition because the video would have just been far too long and you would have been bored. So what I have done is I've created a little pack with all of the key definitions, which I'm going to be providing to my mailing list subscribers. So if you are not already subscribed to my mailing list, please do make sure that you click the link down below to subscribe. If you are already subscribed, then you will receive an email, or you already will have received an email depending on when this goes out and when you see it, where you will be able to download that pack for free. Okay, so first things first, for those of you who don't already know, I did actually make a very brief kind of 5-minute video on what capital markets is at the beginning of my seat. And I spoke about the fact that in my firm, capital markets is split into 5 kind of sub-pillars, and I actually worked across 2 of them. So I sat in debt capital markets and I also sat in structured finance. Now, this video is going to be purely focused on debt capital markets. I will do another similar video on structured finance so that you can have an understanding of what that was like too. In debt capital markets, there were mainly 2 types of deals. There are actually 3 apparently, but I only did 2 types of deals. So again, I'm only going to talk about the 2 types of deals that I personally did. And that is a bond issuance. So that's your kind of typical debt capital markets deal that you'll know about, where we talk about things like a prospectus. And then there's also the program update. Now, I think the easiest way to describe this for now is to think of it as a kind of subsection of a bond issuance. And when I get to what a program update is, you'll understand why I've said that. Now, the third type of deal that I'm not actually going to talk about is something called LPN. So these are loan participation notes. Now, I never actually did a loan participation note kind of deal, so I'm just not going to speak on it, but I will try and include a definition in my pack as well so that you can just have an idea of what that is. Okay, so before we get into what typical kind of trainee tasks I did at each stage and what I did in my past 6 months, let's actually have a look at what the overview of a bond issuance is like. So the first thing that we're going to have is our managers receiving a mandate. Now, please do, like I said, make sure that you sign up to my mailing list so that you can have the full kind of breakdown of all of these key terms. But by managers, for the purposes of this example, we're just looking at banks, and by mandate, we're just looking at instruction. Then we've got due diligence that needs to be conducted. So this would be stage 2. Now, there will actually probably be a couple of different types of due diligence. So there could be financial due diligence, for example, which the banks are likely going to conduct with their auditors and other kind of financial advisors. And then there'll obviously also be the legal due diligence, which we would get involved in. And I will talk a bit about what I did as a trainee in terms of legal due diligence in a second. After that, we're going to actually get into our document. So this is the bit that you're probably more interested in. So we've got our prospectus. That's probably going to be drafted, and it takes quite a while to be agreed sometimes. So that's why we like to start off with the prospectus first. It's also the main document for the actual transaction that we need. Then we've got the subscription agreement, and that's going to be negotiated. Now, this is quite important. Depends on the type of issuance that we're doing, but there's a couple of key things that we might have in the subscription agreement there that I'm going to go into. Then there's just some other legal documentation, and depending on the type of structure that it has, so we'll get into it in my mailing list kind of handout, but whether it's a trustee structure or a fiscal agent structure, then the requisite documents for those 2 structures will be required in the deal as well. Then we've got the preliminary prospectus. So remember, all the way back at the beginning when we said we started drafting it, we're now going to try and agree it and get it printed. Then we've got what we call the roadshow launch. So these are all the presentation materials that go to investors, potential investors of this bond, to basically just convince them that, yeah, this is a great investment for them. And then we've got what we call the pricing of the deal. So here with the pricing, the subscription agreement is going to be signed and the prospectus is also going to be finalized. So remember, we just called it a preliminary prospectus. At this point of the deal, it's now the final prospectus. And then any other documentation that needs to be agreed will be agreed. So we've got, like I said, depending on whether it's a trustee kind of structure or whether it's a fiscal agent structure, all that other documentation can also be agreed as well. And then the deal is going to close. The documentation is going to be signed. The notes are going to be issued. So the notes are the actual instrument that we use to represent a bond, and listing occurs. So the bonds are going to be listed on the relevant stock exchange. So at each stage in this process, what did I as a trainee actually do? when the managers are receiving the mandate, in all honesty, as a trainee, there's not really much I did there. And generally speaking, as a lawyer, there's probably not much that you would be doing if you're a lawyer in private practice. The private practice lawyers don't tend to be involved with the deal at that particular stage. Due diligence being conducted. So like I kind of alluded to at the beginning, there are different types of due diligence that will be conducted. The main type that we are obviously going to be concerned about is the legal due diligence. Now, depending on the nature and the structure of this deal, there are different types of legal due diligence that you would be doing. And as a trainee, due diligence is definitely one of your key roles. So I did actually do some due diligence in my capital market seat. I did 2 different types, I would say, although due diligence is generally the same regardless of what the type is. And when I say I did 2 different types, what I mean is that I did due diligence for a capital markets deal, but I did also do due diligence for a corporate deal which had a capital markets element. So I guess the focus that I had on both of those kind of 2 deals was a bit different, but what I was actually doing was pretty much the same. And what did I actually do? Well, for the capital markets deal, we were acting manager side, so we were acting for the banks. And the way it basically worked is that we were provided with a number of documents, and then I just kind of had to review and go through them, check in on what we call the VDR, so the virtual data room, to make sure that all of the documents that we were expecting to receive were there. And in the instance where there were documents that we think we should have been seeing but they weren't there, we would then ask for those documents. And then I would literally just review them and look for any red flags. So by red flags, I'm talking about things like, especially because this is a capital markets deal, if there are any other kind of financial obligations that the issuer is involved in that we would need to know about. If there have been any times where the issuer has defaulted on any kind of payments, in terms of if there were any bonds that they've taken out before or anything like that. So little things like that were the kind of things that we'd be looking out for. Generally speaking, due diligence can be quite a long task, so it's something that you do need to make sure that you pay a lot of attention to detail because it's very important. And as I said, we're looking for things that would basically just say that this deal can't go ahead. So, you know, it is quite an important role that is given to trainees, and it's a good way for you to show that you can actually manage a particular work stream, because I think a good trainee in this particular instance will be able to show the associate that they're working with maybe at the end of each day or at the end of every other day, depending on how long they have to complete this due diligence, that look, this is where we are, these are the documents we've reviewed, these are the flags that I want to point out to the client, these are the questions that I think we should raise, that sort of thing. So depending on how you are as a person, you may find this interesting, but in all honesty, a lot of people don't particularly like due diligence, but it is something that we do have to do, and it is something that I did do at that stage. So what was stage 3? That was the preliminary prospectus being drafted. Now, in capital markets, I think actually in my first or second week, I was handed over a deal which was quite well on its way in terms of where people were. So the preliminary prospectus had already been drafted, but my role as a trainee was to keep certain parts of that prospectus up to date. So I was looking at things like something called Annex B. Annex B is a list of definitions that are taken from all of the financial documents. So remember I said there could be other documents involved in the transaction depending on what style of transaction it is. In that particular matter, there were a number of finance documents like an indenture, which I had to kind of pull all of the definitions from and keep that updated in Annex B of the prospectus. I was also responsible for updating what we call the summary. So the summary is, as the name suggests, a summary of all of the different parts of the prospectus. So that was quite an easy part to update. And then also just turning comments. And by turning comments, I just mean that when other parties had kind of provided comments on what they wanted changed in that prospectus, whether it be auditors providing changes to numbers, whether it be lawyers on the other side providing changes that their clients have asked for, making sure that all of those comments go in properly, and then making sure that the prospectus was kept up to date, because we were what we call holding the pen, i.e. the ones responsible for drafting that particular document. So as a trainee, that's what I was doing there. Okay, so the next kind of stage is the subscription agreement, and I think I'm also going to tie this into the other documentation stage as well. Now, first thing to say here is that a subscription agreement isn't actually always needed. Now, if you have a look on Practical Law, which is quite a good resource to use, a subscription agreement is the principal agreement between the issuer, the investor, or substitute purchasers in a private placement. of debt obligations. So that keyword there, private placement, is when we actually use a subscription agreement. So it wasn't every deal that I was on that I was, using a subscription agreement, but I do remember one particular deal where we were doing a private placement where we did have a subscription agreement. And there I did actually get to have the first draft at the document. So what I did was I had a precedent that we were using from a previous kind of deal, and then I also had what we call our standard form. So that's our, house template for how we like particular documents to be done. And then I also had the background information that I knew of the client based off of the kickoff call that I had attended and just the conversations that I had with the associate and the partner. So I used all of that to kind of go through the precedent document and see what needed to be tweaked, amended, removed, added, etc. And I was able to kind of draft that document. And similar kind of expectations of a trainee are had with all of the other documentation that's required. So whether you have a trust deed, if it's a trustee kind of structure, whether you have a fiscal agency agreement, if it's a fiscal agent structure, etc., etc. So that's all I basically did there as a trainee. And then if I was the person who started off with the drafting, then I was likely also the person who continued with that work stream. And by continuing with that work stream, what I mean is that when we sent it to the client and the client gave us comments, when we sent it to the other side and the other side gave us comments, it was then my job to make sure that all of those comments kind of went in, obviously with the supervision of my supervisor, but generally speaking, that was kind of my baby, as it were, to look after and take it to the end and execution. Now, the next stage, the roadshow being launched, generally speaking, I think the trainees kind of fall back a little bit with this part of the transaction. The main thing that I did do here though was that depending on what side we were acting on, there would be times where I would review a lot of the marketing material, and I would review a lot of this material against what had been drafted in the prospectus to just kind of make sure that no information that the issuer doesn't necessarily want to be in the public light is being included in this marketing material. So that's probably where a trainee is going to be most helpful in the roadshow kind of stage, and that's all I personally did. With the pricing of the deal and also with the deal closing and with other documents being kind of agreed as well, here, this is kind of similar to what I did in debt finance in the sense that when a deal is signing and closing, signing being when all the documents are signed, closing being when the money moves, that's when the trainee can actually be very, very helpful in showing that they can manage a transaction. And when I say they can manage a transaction, I'm talking about things like making sure they pull signature packs, so for all the documents that need to be signed, getting them to the right entities, to the right parties, making sure signatories are available, keeping a track of when all of those signatures have come back in, if there are any conditions precedents that are required. So you'll often find CPs are in the subscription agreement that I mentioned. If there are any CPs that are required, making sure that they've all been fulfilled, that any of those that needed to be signed have also been signed as well. And then just generally managing the whole kind of execution process. So that will be just a lot of emails and a lot of coordinating with other people to make sure that everything is done at the right time. So that is what I personally did, and that is what you would be doing as a trainee in the different stages of a bond issuance. Now, looking at a program update, this is going to be quite a short section, but I just did want to explain the little difference. A program update is normally a bit more expensive than a standalone issue, and what I just spoke about before was a standalone issue. A program update is something that it's not actually necessary for me to go through all of the stages again because it's pretty much the same stages. The only difference is that a program has to be updated every 12 months, i.e., any CPs that were required in the first issuance will have to be reissued every 12 months. The prospectus will have to be kind of updated every 12 months. So all of the documents that I just mentioned, all of the different stages that I just mentioned will have to be updated every 12 months. And there are general just kind of commercial reasons as to why issuers might decide to do this, which I've included in the pack that's available on my mailing list. So please do make sure that you check it out. But in terms of my role as a trainee here, this was actually a really good chance for me to manage a process from start to finish by myself. And when I say by myself, I was obviously being supervised, but because it was me managing a deal that had in essence already been done before, because it was just an update, there was much more scope for me to have a lot more client contact, a lot more ability to negotiate with the other side in terms of some of the terms that I felt like needed to be included in the documentation, and also just a lot more scope to kind of navigate and discuss with my supervisor how I felt like the deal should progress. So that was a really, really good experience for me, and that's something you might be able to do if you do sit in debt capital markets. Okay, so that was the main bulk of what I did in the past 6 months, to be honest. That was all of the kind of client client chargeable work. But aside from client chargeable stuff, because obviously in your training contract and also just as lawyers, that's not all that we do. We also do a bunch of other things as well. So what else did I do in my capital markets seat? Well, I did quite a lot of client business development. And I think I was just fortunate or unfortunate, depends on whether you like doing BD or not, but I quite like doing it. So I was fortunate in the sense that my first supervisor in this team was counsel, and then my second supervisor was a partner. And then because I kind of sat across two teams, so I sat in another team as well, the other person that I worked a lot with was also a partner. And because partners, just by the nature of their role, do a lot of kind of client work, I also helped out with a lot of different client things. So I helped out with kind of pitching, I helped out with putting together slide decks for training after deals closed and things like that. So that was actually really enjoyable. And it was a key way to get to know some other clients, but also a way to kind of get to know a little bit more about what the client's businesses were outside of the deal. Because I think sometimes as a trainee, especially when you tend to get brought into a matter, yes, you do get background, and yes, you do kind of get stuck into what you're doing, but because you're normally focused on a very niche aspect of the deal, you don't always get to see the bigger picture. You don't always get to find out like this is how the client likes to do certain things from a commercial perspective. So doing BD for me is the best way, I think, to kind of learn a bit more about the client, and I really, really like that. Now, what are the other areas aside from client chargeable work and also some client BD? There's also just general knowledge and know-how kind of training, personal development. Now, people who follow me on my Instagram will know that I do a monthly review to kind of hold myself accountable to my goals. And part of what I do in terms of my goals that I set myself is that I like to do a minimum of 1 hour personal development training and professional development training every month. So in my capital market seat, of course, I have done a whole bunch of different trainings, but I also do a bunch of legal training as well to just be up to date on the law. So because I work at a US firm, I used to attend a weekly US securities law training, which was actually really, really helpful. Even though obviously I'm training to become an English qualified lawyer, a lot of our clients are in the US, so it's kind of helpful to be up to date on those kind of things as well. We also had weekly team meetings where we spoke about a number of different things, but one of those things was also kind of knowledge and know-how training as well. And it was really nice to just hear how, lawyers were talking about different kind of areas that were progressing and arising in the legal field. And if I could contribute, I would, but most of the time I was just listening, which is fine. I think that was a really nice way to just kind of learn by osmosis. So that's something that I did a lot as well. And then finally on pro bono, I didn't actually do any capital market specific pro bono, but as many of you will already know, I do a number of pro bono initiatives for work. So I do a number of kind of different things that I've kind of already discussed. And I did actually win an award for some of my pro bono work at work at the end of last year. So it's definitely something that I take very, very seriously. So hopefully you have found this video super helpful. I think the last kind of thing that I want to do is I want to address some of the questions that came through on Instagram. And then I also just want to wrap up with what kind of key skills do I think you need to thrive in the capital markets seat if this is what you decide to do. So one of the first questions I got from Instagram was, is there a shift in expectations as a second year trainee? If so, how did you manage this? Now, I'm conscious that this video is a bit long, so I am actually going to do a whole separate video on what I think expectations of a second year trainee are kind of like. I think I'm going to wait until I'm a month into this seat and then record that video, because by then I would have a bit more of an understanding. But long story short, I think there definitely is a difference with expectations. And I think one of the main ways you can tell there's a difference is the fact that there's a difference in salary. Second year trainees get paid more than first year trainees, and in a very kind of numbers way. With great, finance comes great responsibility. Like, there is an expectation that you will do more, right? So I think there's definitely that, but I will go into more detail about how I've actually felt that and how I've navigated it in a future video. Second question that we had was, could you explain what is capital markets and what type of work it entails? Now, the first 15 minutes of this video explains what it entails, and I did also do, like I mentioned, a really brief kind of 5-minute video at the beginning of my seat, which you should be able to go and see on my channel, where it kind of breaks down what capital markets is. So hopefully those 2 videos really help you. Final question is, in an IPO, were you able to participate in most, if not all, stages of pre-listing work? Now, unfortunately, it kind of sounds like an equity capital markets question, and I did not do any equity capital markets work at all, so I can't answer. What I will try and do is just speak to some of the equity capital markets trainees and then drop you a line on Instagram, because this question came through on Instagram, so that you can have an answer to that. But unfortunately, I don't really have much to say on it here. Final thing that I wanted to address is, what are my kind of reflections? What kind of person do I think you need to be to excel in a capital markets seat? It's a finance seat, and with most finance seats, the biggest thing is being able to manage process and manage transactions. So I think you need to be very organized. That's first of all. I want to dispel the myth that you need to be amazing at numbers. In my whole 6 months in that seat, there was only one time where I had to do something with numbers. And I think I just had to work out, this was actually on the structured finance side, it wasn't even on the DCM side, but I just had to work out what percentage of the bonds were going to be refinanced. And it was literally just a case of, dividing the original number by like 5 or something like that, because I think it was 5%. So that's all I basically had to do. And even that, a supervisor checked my maths, I promise you. So like, you're not just left alone to just run wild with numbers and go free. So I want to dispel that myth. Finance seats are not necessarily all about the numbers. There is a lot of other stuff that's involved with finance, and we get advisors who are specialists on the numbers to come and do all of the number stuff. So that's fine. I think aside from being like very well organized, I think you also need to be willing to learn, and you need to have a love for learning, because finance is actually quite a technical area of law. And there's no expectation as a trainee that you actually know all about that particular technical area, but there is an expectation that you're willing to train, and you're willing to keep progressing with your learning, and you're willing to kind of come and share what you have learned with the wider team. So I think that's actually very important. I think the final kind of thing that has been really, really important and has been a bugbear for me, so if it's a bugbear for you, honestly, don't worry, you're not in this alone, but it's attention to detail. Finance, like I said, can be quite technical, which means attention to detail is even more important here, because people will pick up on those mistakes. Bankers do not play, like they really do not play. So you need to make sure that your attention to detail is immaculate, and you're also just checking like everything that's going out before it goes out to a client. I think that's really, really important. But anyway, that is my video and my review of capital markets. I really do hope you found this useful and you got a little bit more of an insight into what capital markets was like for me over the past 6 months. If you like this type of content, please do make sure that you like, comment and subscribe, and give me a follow on Instagram as well. And I'll be back again soon with another video.